Hello, everyone, and welcome to this last talk, unfortunately, in the series Coloniality and Decoloniality in Translation. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome Joshua Price, who is going to talk on Untranslatable Dictionaries and Haunted Glossaries, Eve Tuck and Christina Sharpe's Decolonial translation practice. Joshua is an anthropologist and professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. And among other things, he has collaborated on the translation of 2 books of Latin American philosophy. And he writes on translation, colonization, and state violence. So very fitting to this talk series. And his most recent book is entitled Translation and Epistemicide, Racialization of Language in the Americas. And I'm very much looking forward to his talk. Joshua, please.
Thank you, Joanna. I would like to thank you for inviting me. I also wanted to thank Dominik and the University of Freiburg, and to anyone else who made this talk possible. So let's start. Can you see my screen? The PowerPoint? Okay, cool. And as I said to Joanna, if you hear distracting ambient sounds, just let me know, and we'll figure out some emergency plan for my physically moving to another place. There's a lot of construction outside the window. Okay, I'll get right to it. So it's been lovely to listen to the talks in this series, and I've learned a lot. And I'd like to say that for the purposes of this talk, I want to think about the idea of decolonial, not metaphorically. As we'll see later on, Eve Tuck cautions us that that decolonization isn't a metaphor and shouldn't be used that way. Okay, I also wanted to forewarn people that I'll be citing authors who describe a lot of scenes of violence, including racialized violence. So that's, I guess, important to know already. So I'm going to talk about 2 pieces, 2 analyses that contribute to what I take to be a decolonial methodology for translation studies. These 2 essays are Christina Sharpe's preliminary notes towards a dictionary of untranslatable blackness, which is a section of her recent book, Ordinary Notes, and then an article by Eve Tuck and C. Ree called A Glossary of Haunting. So these examples, I argue, defamiliarize 2 technologies that are used by translators everywhere, the dictionary and the glossary. And through analysis, we can distill a set of characteristics that reflect how both use what I see as a decolonial translation methodology. These are intralingual translations, as opposed to interlingual. Okay. I will briefly inventory them, and then I will go into depth about each one of them. So as I say, both defamiliarize language and reveal racialized subtext in colonial epistemology at work, and apparently neutral and anodyne texts and text genres. Secondly, the translated text is aimed at a target language or culture in an imagined world, better and more just than the world we live in now. Third, the translator or translators acknowledge their embodiment and social position. They try not to suppress or evict affect from the translation process. And finally, the translation, or at least the project of translating, troubles ontological certainty, unsettles Western metaphysics more generally, and points the way to multiple realities. Okay, so to start with, I should say that I think of dictionaries and glossaries as sort of really important in the early, especially for Europe in the early Renaissance, as crucial mechanism in terms of the conquest and New World evangelism, as well as colonial administration. So they were used, for example, not just for the standardization. The dictionary was not used just for the standardization of European languages, but also was used in colonial administration to standardize indigenous languages, most notably, for example, Quechua, starting in the 16th century. And they also kind of serve to consolidate the nation and then in essence expand the kind of imperial project. Okay, nevertheless, here we're looking at how these two examples provide both a kind of retrospective look and show that sort of that history, reveal it, but also with sort of embedded within that how there's a kind of subtext of anti-indigeneity and anti-Black perspectives. So it sort of critiques the settler colonialism that we can sort of see historically embedded within the dictionary and the glossary. So in that sense, the dictionary and the glossary in these two texts are not just tools for semantics and communication, but also for ethics and politics and even for potential futures. Thus, the translation project in the dictionary and the glossary cannot be just a question of coloniality, decoloniality, but also of epistemic justice. They offer, to paraphrase Spivak in another context, spectacular opportunities for history to join hands with literary criticism in search of the ethical as it interrupts the epistemological.
Josh, somebody asked in the chat if you can activate like presentation mode.
Yeah, I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to try to do that without, this is sort of old school. So I have one screen. So I'm going to see if I can do that and also read off of my screen, my talk. Let me try to do that and see if I can handle that. And now, is it possible to do that? I think, how about, let me just do this. And that way it'll be like a happy medium. Maybe you can see it a bit better, but I can still see what I'm reading. Okay, can you hear me or is there background noise? Is it distracting? It's okay?
No, it's fine.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. All right, so, so this list that I just showed you, I don't think of it as all of them are necessary, and they're certainly not sufficient to make a translation decolonial, and they're also not exhaustive. It's just some elements that I think are compelling and important. So for example, a decolonial translation project might be for an imagined world a lot worse than the world we live in now. It might not be for a better world. A translator may not think about and acknowledge their own embodiment or affective elements of a translation and still be decolonial. Nevertheless, these are sort of interesting elements that I thought we could discuss a little bit and see if they're compelling without thinking of them as necessary or sufficient. Okay, so let me plunge into each one and talk a little bit about each, and then we'll move to the examples. So a deconstructive embrace, this expression is from Spivak. A deconstructive embrace is translating a text can be a way to draw into question some of the basic elements that are part of the operative logic of Western languages. So for an analytic philosophy, for example, languages can be used for referring and predicating, that is for making descriptive claims about an exterior world. And language is used in Western philosophy from the Greeks on to form syllogisms, sets of claims that are tied together in logical chains along lines of implicature to lead to valid and sound conclusions. Similarly, in conventional terms, dictionaries are premised on the idea that words have definitions that can clarify the meaning of a word. Deconstruction as a method calls these assumptions into question. Deconstruction as a decolonial method frames these assumptions, moreover, as part of the logic and epistemic architecture of colonial thought, which may include white supremacist language or Eurocentric epistemologies. Undermining these assumptions is a way of dismantling the scaffolding of Western epistemology. Okay, 2. The translation is into a language, as I said, that anticipates a better and more just world. Decolonial translations participate in what sociologists have termed prefigurative practices or exhibit a prefigurative politics. They enact the politics or the kind of world or the kind of interpersonal relationships they would like to see. My colleague Marina Citrian and David Graeber have written a lot about prefigurative politics. Put differently, a decolonial methodology begins to bring that imagined world into existence through performing the translation. It is a performative, in Austin's sense. Saying something can be a way of doing something. The translation exists in the semiotic economy of value that is desirable and desired. Such a world may not fully exist and is thus configured in the translation. Embodied. The translator acknowledges their embodiment and their social location. Translation is ideographic, tied to a time and place. Translators are historical subjects and make translation decisions in the context of a range of biographical and sociological factors, including an embodied history, which implies attention to racial and gender embodiment, as well as other axes of difference that manifest themselves in differential perceptions and ways of languaging, that is, dwelling in and using language. Translators are not interchangeable. Affect. Translation has an affective component that is rarely acknowledged. And I say this both as someone who tries to write and think about translation and also on occasion translates, right? So I'm drawing on my experience as a translator as well. So this claim is linked to the previous one about embodiment, and is possibly a corollary. As living subjects situated in history, translators are inflected by a range of emotional tonalities, including grief, hope, frustration, as well as ludic impulses, curiosity, sometimes satisfaction, and occasionally stupefaction. The affective tonalities of translation practice color the translator's choices of text to translate, of the syntax of translation, and of word choices. And finally, a decolonial translation involves a critique of dualist ontologies. That is, it draws into question many of the binaries that drive Western philosophy, such as the mind-body split, the reason-emotion divide, and so on. But more than that, it's also a decolonial translation is predicated on the idea that epistemologies and ontologies are vastly more complicated to bridge than simply searching for alternative words for the same referent. The translation itself troubles terra firma and provides an entry point to multiple worlds. So in pursuit of the ethical as it interrupts the epistemological, Sharpe and Tuck and Ree are these examples that I think reflect these characteristics. Okie dokie. So the first example, this is from Ordinary Notes that was published last year. Christina Sharpe, who's a professor at York University in Toronto, has been described as in the New York Times as shaping a generation of Black thought. An earlier book by her, In the Wake, made a big impact on me. It played out multiple meanings of the word wake, as in a state of alertness, being awake. The trace left on a body of water by a moving object such as a boat or a death ritual. As a point of entry to the, so let me now say that her third book, Ordinary Notes, as the name suggests, is a series of observations of everyday life. And the entries are numbered. They vary in form and length and in rhetorical style. Some are aphoristic, some are narrative descriptions of scenes from Sharpe's everyday life, while others have a kind of evocative poetic register. She also sort of gives the pen over to other authors. So many of the entries are authored by other people. In one section of Ordinary Notes, Sharpe reads in response to Barbara Gassant's Vocabulaire européen des philosophies, what's been translated as the Dictionary of Untranslatables. So she takes this book as a point of departure. And in the book, in Sharpe's book, she looks at this book, the one that's on the screen, and asks with Dion Brand, if one began from black, what would an entry on civilization or claim or archive or memory or life look like, and how would it sound? That's a citation from her. She concludes many of the entries that appear in Cassant's vocabulaire would need to be rethought or unthought if one considered blackness and black people. So that's what launches her onto this entries towards a dictionary of untranslatable blackness. Since Cassant's book really captured my imagination, and I had taught it a bunch of times, I was very taken and intrigued by what Sharpe was going to do with this, so I'm going to look here at what I'm calling Sharpe's deconstructive embrace of the vocabulaire. As preliminary, her entries are evocative, gesturing towards new worlds of meaning and exploring other senses of certain words. Her work also has characteristics of what Philip Lewis has called an abusive translation. An abusive translation values experimentation, tampers with usage, and seeks to match the polyvalencies and plurivocalities and expressive stresses of an original by producing its own. So even while I think of this, her work as, and I say this respectfully, as an abusive translation, even admiringly as an abusive translation, it might be in tension with Christina Sharpe's own understanding of what she's doing. So instead of providing my own vocabulary, let's look at what she describes herself as doing. Okay, so, and I think we can just plunge into some of the entries so you can get a kind of taste of how this reads. This is an excerpt from Christina's description of archive, right? So here we have ordinary notes, this section, preliminary notes towards the untranslatable blackness, is a kind of glossary or dictionary. Archive, a complete catalog of coloniality, a file, a list, a book, an enumeration usually consistent with coloniality, containing information where Black life may limn through but not be deemed a subject of the information. Libraries where these are held, a compendium usually fissured, listing of events, scenes from which Black life must be extracted, extrapolated, interpretation of events managed by colonial practices such as interpretations where Black life is represented as minor or missing, or tangential or subordinate, a resource of and for curators of coloniality. Okay, so as you can see, there's references here or allusions to other authors, probably Saidiya Hartman, McKentrick, and other people who have talked in the same kind of key about Black life in the archive and the idea of a Black archive. And she also, I think, evokes Sylvia Wynter's reading of 1492. She also sometimes takes words that Cassin has used in a different way. So Cassin's book is also kind of looks at the sort of the philosophical history of certain what she sees as keywords. And she provides a different kind of gloss to them. I'm not going to go to Cassin here because of limitations on time, but I would just look at, and sometimes Sharpe circles back. So on one entry, note 175, she describes tenderness as a gesture, a look, a Black look, some regard relayed between people in peril. But then later on, she circles back and let me see how I'm getting to this. Sorry about this, guys. I'm just trying to advance the slide here. Let's see if this works. There it goes. Note 169, tenderness, Sharpe cites Gail Jones. I'm not going to read over the entirety of it. But first she cites Gail Jones and has a kind of sort of situates this idea of tenderness within sort of history of Black life. And then if you see, this is how I'm sort of trying to respect the way that Sharpe lines up these lines. The boy who was carrying Skittles and iced tea, the girl who was by herself and surrounded by hate. I will say this for people who are located outside of the North American or US context. These declarative phrases arranged as a kind of poem, as it were, or maybe an anti-poem, put tenderness in a particular setting. So for an American, I'm an American, even though I live in Canada, these lines evoke Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Elizabeth Eckford in the civil rights movement, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Patricia Dodson, Eric Garner, and others. So these are definitely evocative and of real people and the horror that they face. But also, I think to kind of follow that, you would have to be sort of attuned to the recent history of African Americans in the context of lethal state violence. So I think that maybe gives a bit of a sense of how Sharpe wants to read these words and how she sort of sees them. Let me give a couple more examples before turning to the other one. Okay, well, I think I have to go like this. This is note 179, refusal. Let me just check in for a second. Are we good? Can you hear me? Am I talking too quickly or am I enunciating? Good. Okay, great. This is note 179, and this is an example of where Sharpe is handing the pen over to someone else. So this entry is contributed by Saidia Hartman, her colleague, a historian. Refusal is the shorthand for what can't be named within the conceptual field of the enclosure. It expresses our unwillingness to be conscripted to man's project or world. It is easier to index than to describe. All of the gestures bent on eluding the imposed terms of order and value, the me and the mine, the propertied earth, the vision of us in the clearing that conveys it. So you can see here that there's a kind of sensitivity to the limitations of expression and communication. So if I kind of dart back for 1 second here, just so we can look back at this. You can perhaps see, and I won't enumerate this, but perhaps you can see how these characteristics that I sort of tried to extract or see reflected in Christina Sharpe's text are sort of part of her methodology, is what I'm calling her methodology, her deconstructive methodology. Okay, so I also wanted to, yeah, okay. So here's the last entry before we go to Tuck and Ray. Barbara Casson has famously said that untranslatable is not something that can't be translated, but rather what someone keeps on translating or not translating. So the untranslatable for Casson is something that's untranslatable just means it's a never-ending process of translating. It's an ongoing process. And this, I think, there's a kind of, even though Sharpe is obviously departing in significant ways from Casson, there's a kind of homage here to this idea of untranslation as a never-ending process. Yet, nevertheless, with Sharpe and here with Hartman, as you can see in this citation, there's something much more radical going on. Black life is often something that's missing from the archives, and that cannot easily be named, and it can be indexed rather than described. It's a fugitive in language that eludes capture. And we can also see this, though, nevertheless, in a kind of celebration, and there's a sort of celebratory air that ends this section. Dion Brand, this is also from Sharpe's book, precarious, a state of constant danger, balancing a state of constant danger, the ability to predict, though not always prevent the proximity of effects of this line of peril, the knowledge that one might fall off the edge. Savannah Changé. Life is the song, death is the bass line. Festooned with sweat and grief, we keep dancing. And then finally, this is from Christina Sharpe herself. Life is what remains of the remains, the afterlife of sodium, dirt, and ashes, the possibility of touch, your hand in mine, the ethics of dust, the still life of soil. Okay. So this particular entry, life, goes on for several pages, and each entry is from a different writer on the sort of idea of life and implicitly Black life. Okay, and now I would like to turn to this idea of haunting. Glossary of Haunting from 2014. Unlike Sharpe's text, Tuck and Ree's Glossary of Haunting is in alphabetical order, but it's no less distinctive for that. The alphabetized terms are quirky, self-referential, and riddling. For example, the first entry is itself self-referential, an alphabet of terms. This is a glossary written by two women, both theorists and artists, in the first person singular. A glossary ordinarily comes after a text to define and specify terms to ensure legibility. Glossaries can help readers to pause and make sense of something cramped and tightly worded. In this case, the glossary appears without its host, perhaps because it has gone missing or it has been buried alive, or because it is still being written. Maybe I ate it. It has an appendix, a remnant, which is its own form of language, haunting, its own lingering. Okay, so you can see here that from the first sentence, rendering themselves in the singular voice, right? It's by two authors. The author signaled that the narrative voice will not be entirely reliable in the literary sense. So it's like an unreliable translator. Indeed, the penultimate sentence, maybe I ate it, it has a tone of mockery. Are they mocking academic convention, the reader, themselves? Perhaps they are mocking the educational system if one takes it that they are alluding to that old chestnut of an excuse that students supposedly use to apologize for missing homework, as in, my dog ate it. But there's something else lurking here, a phantom. The specters of something dark and violent, something possibly buried alive. The authors continue in this tone that is at once foreboding and playful. The following sections are entitled, Am I Telling You a Story? And then American Horror as depicted in film. Then American Anxieties, Settler Colonialism Horrors. But Why Haunting? The composite narrative, the combined eye. Let me just go forward here and you can see this. For example, I'm excerpting American Anxieties. Colonization is as horrific as humanity gets. Genocide, desecration, pox blankets, rape, humiliation. Settler colonialism then becomes, because it is the structure and not just a nefarious way that nations are born. Here referencing this idea from Peter Wolff that colonization is settler colonialism is a structure and not just an event, is an ongoing horror made visible by its persistence, the snake in the flooded basement. And then they describe settler colonialism as a triad: the indigenous inhabitant present only because of her erasure, the chattel slave whose body is property and murderable, and C, the inventive settler whose memory becomes history and whose ideology becomes reason. Located as I am in the States, and in Canada and North America, this idea of sort of settler colonialism and this triad of slave, the colonial subject, and the indigenous person makes particular sense. But clearly this idea in this sort of larger vision of settler colonialism can apply in other cases and in other ways, vividly what's going on now in other parts of the world. It was sort of, as I was sort of reflecting on recent events and reading Tuck and Rhee again, it made me kind of reflect on this way of thinking about settler colonialism. Okay. All right. And there are other ways I think that they both take this genre of the glossary and undermine it, and what the situationists would call deturn it. I care about your understanding, but I care more about the concealing my parts of myself from you. I don't trust you very much. You are not always aware of how you can be dangerous to me, and this makes me dangerous to you. I'm using my arm to determine the length of the gaze. So this, as you can see, despite the apparent linearity of alphabetization, this glossary double back, elaborates, caroms off of itself. It comes back to why haunting. The authors offer in the form of a gloss. Let me see here. I should have lost my I'll just read it. Why haunting? Haunting is the cost of subjugation. It is the price paid for violence and for genocide. They enact the haunting they describe and refusing to give in to it. or to silence. So here you can see also this characteristic that some critics have pointed out in a lot of Latin American literature as well, this idea that, for example, if you think of the famous testimonial of Rigoberta Menchú, that the authors are directing themselves directly to the readers and suggesting and making explicit that they're concealing parts of themselves, even in the context of writing. And that seems like a very important part of this glossary of haunting as well. Okay, so I want to return briefly to something that I sort of cited Tuck and Ree at the beginning. In their gloss of decolonization, they write, I want to slip a note into some people's pockets. Decolonization is not a metaphor, because at some point we're going to have to talk about returning stolen land. My guess is that people are going to be really reluctant to give up that ghost. So finally, and this is also something that Eve Tuck has elaborated elsewhere, in this idea of moving away from what Tuck has called damaged narratives. Damaged narratives are the only stories that get told about me unless I'm the one that's telling them. This is situating themselves as indigenous people. People have made their careers on telling stories of damage about me and about communities like mine. Damage is the only way that monsters and future ghosts are conjured. And this, I would say, then, by what emerges at the end of the glossary, is a narrative of the haunting of settler colonial societies. And this may be a final irony, that despite its highly unconventional form as a glossary, with its barbed critiques and mischievous subversive tone, it makes a firm argument for haunting as an important and constituent element of modernity, to paraphrase Avery Gordon. Okay, so in conclusion, I just would like to go back to these characteristics, and maybe, of course, I'm interested in your thoughts, in your comments, in your concerns, your critiques. But I wanted to just say that, so in taking these two pieces of work, Sharpe's work on this preliminary dictionary of untranslatable blackness, and Tuck and Ree's glossary of haunting, I saw both a kind of challenge to these pieces of work as genres, right? So a deconstruction of the idea of a dictionary or of a translation itself, a deconstruction of the idea of a glossary, and then particularly if you think of, as I say at the beginning, colonial administrators, missionaries during the colonial period, but also their latter-day equivalents, using dictionaries and glossaries for colonial administration in the broad and the narrow sense. Both of these works are challenging that that sort of power relationship and how it's embodied in language, and then in that sense also challenging dictionaries as a kind of technology. Secondly, that there is something hopeful. As I say, Tuck wants to move us away from damaged narratives, and Sharpe, although fully countenancing so much of the anti-Black violence in the contemporary world and historically, also wants to move us to a world, and then here I could just go back to what Shange says here: life is the song, death is the bass line. Festooned with sweat and grief, we keep dancing. So there's something hopeful here. There's something looking forward. It might be partially realized, but also not fully realized. And that's what I meant by kind of prefigurative politics. And then just to mention the last 2 points, I think that both social position, embodiment, affect are all part of the work, and they're not excommunicated from the process of translating and of writing. And then finally, as I said, if you think of definitions and glosses as being challenged, like the very stability of language and that the world we live in and perceptions and reality as being challenged in these are also kind of characteristics that I see in these works. And that seem important and kind of key to understanding what the importance is. So on that note, I'll conclude, and I'd like to turn it over to Dominik and hear what he has to say, as well as everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominik.
Yeah, thank you very much for this most interesting talk. I'm still thinking about a lot of what you have said. And maybe I start with one thing I find very curious, and that is the idea of the dictionary as a tool, and that these texts you just talked about, that they, through this defamiliarization, they make the tool, they shape the tool in a way, or that it's not useful anymore, but that it lets us see or notice maybe hidden goals that this was used for. And then in this context, I find it very interesting what you would say, whether these works you talked about, they consider themselves as maybe maybe steps towards a new methodology or a new way of thinking or a new method of translating within decolonial context, or if you'd say that they regard themselves more as a form of art, or maybe that they deconstruct this distinction between art and, let's say, science or theory of translation. This, I think, has to do also this question with the old question in translation theory of fidelity and freedom. I think it's a very specific dialectic in these works you talked about, that on the one hand they are very free in redescribing and the notes or the categories they talk about, but on the other hand they're trying to hit a new kind of fidelity. They have obviously a political agenda, and in the example of the decolonization not being a metaphor, it really hits the point in that it's not supposed to be free in the sense of a free translation, but it's supposed to be very very true to a certain political or ethical agenda. I would very thankful if you could elaborate a little bit more about these topics.
Okay, for sure. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, okay, so you in terms of the dictionary as a tool, that you said you found it curious. I mean, I guess I'll say a couple of things. One is a historical point, and then maybe just the fact that dictionaries are omnipresent. I mean, I think it's almost a kind of trope of a lot of research papers to look at the dictionary definition of something, like according to such and such a dictionary, this word means such and such. And of course, translators use dictionaries all the time. And I found both of these texts to draw, as you suggest, the question of genre into question, like whether it's, as you put, is this poetry? Is this meant to be a kind of dictionary? Is this meant to be something in human sciences as a research paper? So there's a question mark put over the question of genre, but also dictionaries as stable. And I think that for a kind of classic deconstructionists, even forgetting the kind of colonial critique, deconstruction, if it contributes anything, it's to see language and its referential properties as it's a bit of an illusion, right? That the referential quality of words, when you peer into it and try to really focus on it, a deconstructive approach would sort of see language as fundamentally unstable. And what I'm suggesting here is that both Sharpe and Tuck and Rhee want to underscore that unreliability of something that seems as stable and stolid and reliable as a dictionary definition. But then it's particularly a decolonial deconstructive embrace because it wants to see the kind of the way in which anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity has been tied historically into it. And they both are sort of they're all looking at history. In that sense, that brings me to my second point about dictionaries. I know best the history of dictionaries in the context of the Iberian Peninsula and Spain and the Spanish conquest. So as far as I know, the first dictionary of Rubias is Tesoro de la Lengua Castellana, I think it's called, Castellano. And Nebrijas sort of provided in, I think, 1492, the first grammar of the Spanish language. And so you have this idea of the grammar as a kind of technology, and the dictionary emerging, dictionary emerges in 1605, at the sort of the cusp of the conquest. And these dictionaries, bilingual dictionaries, glossaries, were all used as these missionaries went out into parts of Latin America and were trying to figure out, okay, how do we evangelize to the indigenous people? I've written about this elsewhere. And then also, as I was sort of suggesting, they were used to both, as Spain was consolidating itself from all of these different little kingdoms, and then within the sort of expanding Spanish Empire, to establish languages and language uniformity and standardization for the sake of both evangelizing as well as for administering their newly gotten lands, as well as sort of after the sort of as part of the expulsion of the Moors and the Jews from Spain, to sort of say, this is Spain. It's not just one little kingdom, but now we have Spanish, and there's a Spanish grammar, and this is how we speak it. And this is the sort of, you can see it much later happening in Italy and other parts of Europe. So that, I think, is also the kind of history that Tuck and Sharpe are pointing to, the kind of key place of this dictionary as a kind of technology in that process, and how it's been concomitant with racial domination and colonization. And that seems very important. And it's both implicit and at points explicit in their text. So that's what I'm calling the kind of decolonial, deconstructive embrace, as they're taking these genres and they're playing with them. And yeah, let me just stop there. And I'll just say also that with this idea of fidelity, of course, as well, as you could see from the glosses, and we can go back to the slides if you guys want to. They're departing radically from any conventional notion of fidelity, and I would say implicitly critiquing that concept, right? And so let me stop there and see if that makes sense, Dominik, as well as if anyone else wants to.
One maybe a question back to you, but isn't this this notion of decolonization not being a metaphor? Isn't that a attempt to be very specific? So to be in another department, to be to have or to show some fidelity, to say no, it's we mean something which is giving back land, when and that is what is our aim. That's what the goal is here. So I mean that was what I'm curious about. What I was curious about, that the method is a very free translation, but the goal, the end of decolonization, is something that is pinned down pretty accurately in it means giving back land. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So this is my response to that. I would think that let me put it this way. I love Derrida's work. I've learned tons from it. It's fantastic in many, many ways. What I don't want to give up, and I think these authors, maybe put it this way, I don't think these authors want to give up is, even though, and I'm not even saying they're using Derrida's tools of deconstruction, but it's what we could call more broadly deconstruction, is that we're left with everything being meaningless, and that language is meaningless, or that there is no external world. And I think that the deconstructive embrace becomes a decolonial embrace precisely at the moment of material politics as well. So it's not a disavowal of the world of politics, but really an embrace of it, and seeing deconstruction as a tool towards kind of a political end, saying land back, or an end to settler colonialism, or an end to bombing, and people are dying. And I think that that's what I see as maybe separating Sharpe and Tuck from what might seem superficially some aspects of what used to be, post-colonial, postmodernism, right? So there's a kind of postmodern play with ideas, but with an attention to the material consequences of that, and the kind of earnest and authentic concern with brute realities and death, and fighting against death, and fighting for a better world. So that's how I would sort of respond to that point.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.